The most recent Yoon-Kishida summit here in capital Seoul this past Sunday is fueling hopes for a regional rebound in tangible economic activity, especially amid the broader challenges in the global market. So what are the prospects of greater bilateral economic gains amid the latest rapprochement effort? What is the purpose of the future partnerships funds by Korean and Japanese business lobbies? And how does Japan's false territorial claim over Korea's Dokdo look to affect bilateral ties? Welcome to Issues and Insiders. Today we assess the latest top-level diplomatic interaction between Seoul and Tokyo and its broader implications, especially on the economic front. For this, I have Professor Song Soo-young at Chung-Ang University live on the line. Professor Song, it's been a while. Welcome back.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me, and good afternoon to you.
Right, Professor. Right. Yeah. I also have Kwon Soa with us. Soa, as always, thank you for being here.
Hi, Sunny.
Right, so let's start here in the studio then. Let's start off with the public response here on the local front with regard to Japanese Prime Minister Fumio-Kishida's expression of sorrow with regard to the sufferings of Koreans in forced labor during Japan's colonial rule.
Right, for that, let's recap what Prime Minister Fumio-Kishida exactly said in his remarks regarding historical issues or in specific Koreans that suffered forced labor during Japan's colonial rule, as that appeared to be what Prime Minister Kishida was referring to when he said, quote, "My heart aches as many people went through a very difficult and sad experience in the harsh environment at that time." He also said he was touched by the fact that many people opened their hearts to the future while still remembering the painful memories of the past. So it seemed like an expression of sympathy for the victims of Japan's wartime forced labor and appreciation towards the Yoon administration's efforts in dealing with the compensation issue for forced laborers. But this was a statement made on a personal note, as Prime Minister Kishida made clear. And prior to these words, he said, the Japanese government's position remains as it has been, clarifying that he inherits the stance of previous cabinets in terms of recognizing history, including a 1998 agreement. Now, the 1998 declaration, then Prime Minister Obuchi Keizo expressed his deep remorse and heartfelt apology. However, Kishida said previous cabinets, which means all the other cabinets as well. And that also would include late Shinzo Abe's cabinet as well, which did not see the need for an apology. So there were mixed responses regarding this statement. The presidential office of South Korea appeared to be pleasantly surprised at the statement. It did not expect it to be addressed by the issue to be addressed by Prime Minister Kishida first at the summit, because there were no prior agreements on this specific issue and how he's going to word his opinion on this. Nevertheless, there was not much difference from the wordings he had in his March summit in terms of Japan's lack of an apology from the government. So all in all, it was not well received by the public here in Korea, and also some organizations rallied during Kishida's stay, criticizing the South Korean and Japanese governments, continuously saying, let's move towards the future while having historical issues unresolved. So they're calling for a righteous solution is needed to move toward the future so that we can have genuine peace and a genuine future of the two ties.
Right, of course. So prior to the latest Yoon-Kishida summit, though, National Security Adviser Cho Tae-yong, I believe, claimed the results of this particular summit would prompt the South Korean audience to applaud the normalization of bilateral ties. Have his words been proven true, do you think?
Well, according to what President Yoon Suk-yeol stated following the summit, maybe these words have been proven true or will be in the future. As he said, the two leaders confirmed that improving Korea-Japan relations would be a great benefit to the people of both countries, and agreed to continue to develop bilateral relations to a higher level. So going back to what National Security Adviser Cho Tae-yong said. He spoke to local media prior to the summit, expressing his anticipation on the resumption of the shuttle diplomacy, and he highlighted the government's efforts to make the nation's people really feel that this normalization of talks does bring benefits to the people. And that was also mentioned during the talks between Cho and also his Japanese counterpart, Takeo Akiba, Secretary General of Japan's National Security Secretariat. And Cho was of the opinion that while there are things of the past, the important thing right now is the balance between the past and the future. So basically what Cho appeared to be trying to convey is that regardless of historical issues that had strained the nation's ties for years, moving forward towards the future will bring more gains than losses to the people of the two countries. And that could be in the realms of economy or security. And also speaking of security, Cho also expressed high anticipation regarding talks on security issues with the U.S. as well, so trilateral talks which could happen at the G7 summit later this month. And also demonstrating that the two governments are putting efforts in leaving the past behind, or rather I should say aside, or at least separating historical issues with joint cooperation issues. Yoon and Kishida agreed on a visit by a group of South Korean experts to inspect Japan's plan to release radioactive water from the crippled Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant.
Right, with that visit taking place later this month, I believe. Professor Song, bilateral economic interactions also topped talks this time around. First of all, then, do tell us a bit about the exchanges on the economic front prior to and after the two countries' decision to remove each other from their list of preferred trade partners, I believe, back in 2019.
Actually, in retrospect, we have to go back to 1915 rather than to 2019, because in 2015, there was some illicit, some kind of secret agreement between the foreign minister at that time, then the Kishida, current prime minister of Japan, and the Park Geun-hye administration has agreed upon each other to pay some kind of some subrogation possible. So this is the, actually during that year, in the 2015 and the 2016, the trade between the two countries has been reduced by very quietly, quite a size. So in the size it has been reached as low as the trade level, the import and the export level under the current conflict between Korea and Japan. So when we say about but in 2019, the difference is Japan has started because of the observing our country, Korea's jurisdiction decision making about the Japanese corporation, Mitsui and some Mitsubishi heavy industry. They are required to pay back the compensation for their forced labor at the level of a civil level, not at the government level. Then Japan started retaliation because they removed the Korea's preferential status in the trade. So they removed they begin to some export control and removing the South Korea from the white list. So in retaliation, then we have some equivalent and similar steps, and we brought the issues to the WTO. So since then, there is some the reduction of the trade between the two countries. So, of course, because of particularly the fluorine, the semiconductors, three important goods: fluorinated polyimide and the hydrogen fluoride, and the photoresist was just banned by the Japanese government. Then. Initially, Korea had suffered from, we must find some alternative source to get the supply of these materials, because these are very essential materials for the production of semiconductor. Then, as time goes by, then the domestic industry has developed some equivalent materials to be used for the semiconductor still. But however, the small and medium enterprise, Korean economy has relied upon the Japanese parts and some materials and also some equipments. Therefore, the small and medium enterprise, they not only rely much on some parts and materials and equipment imported from Japan, but the big companies such as Samsung, Hyundai, SK, relatively they did not suffer much from this kind of conflict between South Korea and Japan. Now, currently, we are going back to what it used to be. At least the Kishi, the prime minister, promised to reinvigorate the status of South Korea to be listed in the white list again. And reciprocal, Korea has withdrawn in advance. Korea has withdrawn the issues that was brought to WTO has been withdrawn. But currently, WTO does not anymore play any meaningful role in economic sense in the trade. Therefore, I don't know. We have to wait and see how it will be played out.
Right then. So while these trade ties are seen to go back on track, Professor Song, what look to be the economic merits of greater trade with neighboring Japan for South Korea?
When I found some interesting article that has been written in the 2022, and that the GDP loss because of the conflict between the South Korea and Japan is much larger for South Korea than Japan. But that is naturally true because the reliance of the economic trade between South Korea is actually South Korea is from the always has not suffered, but always we are in some trade deficit. And Japan has enjoyed the trade surplus for the past several decades because we rely on, as I mentioned earlier, that parts and important parts and essential parts and materials and some important essential equipments are usually imported from Japan. And they are heavily, mostly used in the small and medium enterprise. So that's why we have suffered a little more than Japan has suffered from the reduced trade. And when the suffering has estimated in terms of the GDP reduction for the both countries. So that it means that for the time, in the short term, clearly we are in some loss side, clearly. But however, if we make some industry has been developed and grown again to replace the essential materials, parts, and equipments imported from Japan could be generated or produced within domestic industry. I think in the long run, that is another benefit. So currently, just in the short run, when we look back, in hindsight, we suffered much more in terms of the reduction of GDP. That is clearly true. However, in the long run, what would be the true, genuine contribution between these? Of course, the cooperation is always beneficial for both countries. But what is important is we must have developed our competitiveness. And then when such kind of economic sanction and threat occurs in the future, we must be prepared for that. We must increase and grow the domestic industry.
Right, of course, and of course diversify our markets as well then. Meanwhile, so back in March, business lobbies of Korea and Japan agreed to set up future partnership funds to support joint research and exchange programs. What is the latest on that front?
Right. It looks like the two countries are in their last-minute preparations to launch the so-called Future Youth Fund, ushering into their future-oriented ties. And it's a fund to be established by the two countries' largest business lobby groups. And that's been actually announced during President Yoon Suk-yeol's trip to Japan earlier in March. I think they made the announcement a few hours before the actual summit between President Yoon and Prime Minister Fumio-Kishida. And this time when Prime Minister Kishida was in Korea, he had a meeting with these people involved in this fund, just like President Yoon did when he was in Tokyo. And that's the Federation of Korean Industries here on the Korean side, and Japan Business Federation on the Japanese side, which is also referred to as the Keidannen business lobby. So these two are involved in this project. And in fact, tomorrow in Tokyo, they are expected to meet and then lay out the details regarding this joint operation. And let me get into some of the details. The fund is to support joint projects, including on research, global issues of mutual concern, youth exchange programs, and so forth. But if we look at the background on why this kind of fund was established, this actually has got to do with historical issues as well, because the idea of such fund was tentatively agreed upon earlier as part of a resolution to the compensation issue of wartime forced laborers. So the question is whether actually those Japanese companies that were involved in forced labor back during Japan's colonial rule will voluntarily participate in the fundings. Now, Kim Byung-jun, the acting chairman of FKI, so the Korean side, avoided to answer the question when he was asked recently when Kishida was here in Korea. And Kishida, what he mentioned was that he hopes that businesses would actively put their efforts in the fund. So maybe it was kind of implying that he wishes that the companies that actually were involved in forced labor would participate in this fund.
Right, I see. Meanwhile, so a territorial dispute remains between the two countries amid Japan's, of course, false claims over South Korea's Tokto Island. And I believe heated debate also erupted right before the summit on Sunday, right?
Right. A lawmaker of the main opposition Democratic Party, Chun Yong-gi, and a number of young party makers made a visit to South Korea's easternmost islets of Tokto exactly a week ago on Tuesday. So that would be less than a week before the summit between President Yoon Suk-yeol and his Japanese counterpart. So Tokyo protested this move as it has been for years falsely claiming sovereignty over Tokto, which it calls Takeshima. And regarding that, the DP's lawmaker again protested against this protest, saying this is a clear infringement upon sovereignty and interference in domestic affairs. Now, Seoul's foreign ministry also criticized Japan's protest, as it always does whenever Japan makes these kinds of statements regarding Tokto. But Chun, the lawmaker of the DP, actually said that the government has to do more, has to have stronger remarks regarding this issue. Now, some people might say, why did they make the visit just a few days before the summit, while the two countries are trying to improve their ties? But others say, why should we here in Korea even have to consider such concerns? And Chun, in fact, in an interview said it's nothing different than making a visit to the southernmost island of Jeju. Now, the long-standing territorial dispute over Tokto, although I don't really want to call it a dispute because it may, from the outside world, it may look as if the two countries are fighting over this territory. However, this issue was not expected to be one of the main agenda during the bilateral summit between President Yoon and Prime Minister Kishida. But with the latest incident or the visit, it appears to have been touched upon. Some media here in Korea as well as in Japan do say that there were questions regarding Tokto, and then both sides just conveyed their own positions on the issue as they have been done before.
Right, I see. Beyond their historical and territorial disputes, Professor Song, I understand there is much to anticipate with regard to potential bilateral exchanges on the semiconductor and battery sectors. Could you tell us a bit more?
Yeah, the implication of this, the Kishida and the Yoon summit is to restore the stability and the security of the global supply chain for the semiconductor. The cutting edge front of semiconductor is like how efficiently produce the semiconductor whose size is very small. So it's like a lithography issue and a mask issue. And also, how can we those semiconductor manufacturing companies produce those semiconductors in the systemic semiconductors? So how to integrate those semiconductors to satisfy some very highly efficiently performing semiconductor. I think that is the confront issue. But recently, the Japan has been known, according to the presidential office in South Korea has made that the Japanese investors come to Yongin cluster, which is a hub for the semiconductor front edge, the cutting edge front of the semiconductor producer. But as long as it is realized, that is going to be a really good news to the Korean economy. But in return, Japan asked some big Korean companies such as Samsung and SK Hynix or other companies to come and make a meaningful reciprocal investment in Japan. So that is going to be an issue, and we are going to see. And then these economic issues is always overwhelmingly just a control, not in the underhand of the political issues. That is clear, but we have to take into account the limits of the current Prime Minister of Kishida, because Kishida is from the fourth largest faction within the leading Democratic Party in Japan. So to that regard, his status as a prime minister is not affected by the general opinion in Japan. Rather, his status is really influenced by some major faction within the leading Democratic Party, and who criticize even the Kishida's individual condolence for the forced labor workers and sex slaves in the issues, and then. The far-right factions in LDP has criticized that Kishida has made too much concession. So that means that its political problem is plays much more important role, and then we have to be prepared whether Kishida will retain the current status or not. That is a really upcoming issue for even in terms of economic ties.
I see. And very briefly speaking then, Professor Song, do you suppose stronger ties between Seoul and Tokyo, in the midst of all those differences, would that ensure stronger supply chains?
Oh, yeah. As long as they both make both investment and securely and stably. But always what I'm saying, the reason why the political issues much more becomes overwhelming stance over the economic issues. That is the problem. Yeah.
I see. And so, very briefly speaking as well, what are some of the issues of bilateral interest that may be addressed during the upcoming G7 summit that you mentioned earlier?
Right. President Yoon has been invited by Prime Minister Kishida as a non-G7 member to Hiroshima. And at their joint press conference, the two sides have expressed their anticipation towards the G7 summit. And President Yoon said that he hopes to fine-tune cooperation with Japan on global issues, health issues, global supply chain issues, as well as climate change. But there are also expectations of not just another bilateral summit, but another trilateral summit along with U.S. President Joe Biden. And what's expected to be on the agenda there, trilateral cooperation against North Korea. And also, it might include some talks regarding the Washington Declaration that Presidents Biden and Yoon just recently talked about, whether Japan could be involved in such. But officials here are cautious on its involvement in the nuclear consultative group. And one more thing I want to mention is that President Yoon and Prime Minister Kishida plan to visit together a monument dedicated to the Korean victims of the atomic bombing in Hiroshima, which will be seen as another symbolic gesture of the two countries improving ties.
Right, I see. All right, so as always, thank you very much for your time. And
pleasure.
Professor Song, thank you so much for your insights today.
Yeah, thank you.
Right, well, that is all the time we have for this edition of Issues and Insiders. Thank you for watching. See you same time tomorrow, that is Wednesday.